I'm Justin Cammy, professor of Jewish Studies and World Literatures at Smith College, and translator from the Yiddish of a critical edition of Abraham Sutzkever's From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg, published in 2021 by McGill-QUP University Press. Sutzkever was one of the most prolific Jewish poets of the ghettos. He eventually made his way to Moscow, where in 1944, he was commissioned to write a chronicle of the ghetto for the proposed Black Book project of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. That project was later stymied by Stalin's commissars, and Sutzkever's ghetto memoir eventually appeared on its own in early 1946, in two slightly different editions in Moscow and in Paris. Though Sutzkever would go on to publish some 24 volumes of Yiddish poetry and fiction and edit the leading Yiddish journal of the post-war period, he never sought the republication of his ghetto memoir. Now, for the first time, it is available to an English reading audience on the 75th anniversary of its original publication. In addition to the memoir, my translation also includes Sutzkever's diary notes from his testimony at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal, the court transcript of his testimony, and 3 reminiscences of figures he associated with in Moscow while he composed his memoir: the Soviet Jewish writer Ilya Ehrenburg, the modernist Yiddish poet Peretz Markish, and the director of the Moscow State Yiddish Theater, Ilya Ehrenburg. My colleague Avraham Novelstein and I provide a thick afterword to put the memoir in historical and literary context. My hope is that this volume will be of interest not only to readers interested in Holocaust narrative and memory, but also to potential visitors to Vilnius, who might discover through it a dark chapter of this city's amazing and diverse Jewish history. Lastly, given that Sutzkever lived in a world in which Yiddish defined the urban space of its Jewish residents, readers will notice that I attempted to keep most street names in Yiddish to reflect that reality. I'm pleased today to read for Translators Aloud from the beginning of Von Vilna Ghetto, from the Vilna Ghetto. In German clause, in the city and on the road, part 1. When I turned on the radio the morning of June 22nd, a hysterical German scream leapt out at me like a pack of lizards. From the clamor, I realized that the German army had crossed the border. I darted outside, eager for a familiar face. I came across Noach Prilutsky, professor of Yiddish studies at Vilnius University. He was absorbed in his research on Yiddish phonetics. Hitler began to dig his own grave with the first bomb dropped on Russian territory, Prilutsky prophesied, but he had no advice about what we ought to do. He turned back to his work. Firefighters rushed to the streets. A fire was burning next to the Green Bridge. I turned towards Mother's home, which was located just beyond the bridge. She was relieved to see me. She showered me with kisses and tried to assure me that everything would be all right. She prepared a sorrel soup for me and added in some cream. The bombs fell relentlessly. Across the Velia River, a gas reservoir was on fire. The smell made it all the way to our little room and tore at our throats. Mother, we have to save ourselves. She stroked my hair, kissed my forehead, and with a painful expression I will never forget, told me, I'm not going anywhere, but you are my life. Go and save yourself. You have your entire life ahead of you. I went to see David Umru, editor of the local Yiddish newspaper Emes. We sat down and planned our escape. Close to midnight, a blinding light illuminated the room. Airplanes were dropping flares in the night sky. We saw German paratroopers landing in the vicinity of the Hill of Three Crosses through the window. Enemy aircraft flew low over the city. At the intersection of Glezer and Breta streets, a brick building collapsed. 60 people were trapped beneath the rubble. More homes were destroyed on Poltova Street. Smoke from the fires spread throughout the city. People grabbed whatever possessions they could carry and tried to escape. The noise in the distance warned that the Germans were closing in and that they would soon subject Vilna to their will. We ran as fast as we could, a group of writers, friends, and acquaintances. I abandoned my apartment. The only valuables I managed to take with me were the freshly printed pages of my poem Sibir, Siberia. My wife grabbed the diary that she had been filling for 10 years. We followed Suboch Street in the direction of Minsk. We approached a caravan of Jews. The wagons were stuffed with pillows and women. We learned from one of the draymen that he was fleeing with his family from the cheap houses. He knew a peasant in the village of Slobode. They would live out the war with him there. He would return once the Germans were repelled. The highway grew more congested by the minute. Young people, adults, and even the aged streamed eastward towards the Soviet interior. We were fleeing the plague, but the plague was close behind. German airplanes were like swarms of locusts. They targeted individuals from the air. Our group was separated in the scramble. Umru and his wife were lost in the confusion. I was left holding their feverish child. I wanted to step into a roadside hut to find some water for the child, but they were all empty. The peasants had fled too. Night. We slept in the forest. Red Army soldiers warned us to hide because German troops disguised in Red Army fatigues had parachuted behind enemy lines and were quickly approaching. My friend's child started to cry. He missed his mother. He was hungry. My heart was breaking. I gathered a few berries in the moonlight and gave them to him. He was not going to die in my arms. The Germans overtook us near Oshmene. In the distance, we could hear the rumble of tanks. Peasants told us the entire area was swarming with Germans. Where could we turn? And I was carrying this child. Villages were aflame. What to do? Now I'm going to read from another section, and we'll continue where we left off. We saw many Soviet planes buzzing overhead. They were battling the German Luftwaffe just below the clouds. Several crashed nearby, enveloped in smoke. Not far from Vilna, I found the father of the child that I had been carrying all this time. I returned the baby to him, relieved that I had been able to keep him alive. We spent the night in a peasant's woman's barn. Through the sparks, we could see Nai Vilike in the flames. At night, motorcycles pulled up to the barn. I overheard the language that was defiling Europe. German police were searching the village. They called out to our peasant women and asked whether they were hiding any Jews. My friends were asleep. I was the only one awake. Our lives depended on their response. She replied in her native language, "No, there's nobody here." And the police continued on their way. Tanks, tanks, tanks. The entire Oshmena highway was a chain of tanks. The clamor was deafening. We held out for a half day. In the end, we tore ourselves away. We backtracked along the same road on which we had fled. We washed ourselves in the Vilinke River. We tore up our identity papers and documents in case we were searched. My wife kissed her diary and page by page abandoned it to the river. I'll read one final section from that first part of the memoir, and that has to do with Sutzkever and his mother and him hiding at her house. It's called The Axe. My mother momentarily forgot the German regulations and stepped on the sidewalk. A stormtrooper grabbed her by the hair and struck her face with his whip. When she fell to the ground, lying in her own blood, the gutter, he burst out in thunderous laughter and left. A neighbor brought her home. I washed off her blood, and for the first time, I felt the spark of vengeance ignite within me. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the entrance. I hid in the dark little room that served as our kitchen. Two Jew snatchers entered. I was standing in the tiny room, glued to the wall, and heard them speaking. Since ours was a poor home, they were not looking for gold. They were sniffing out people. Seeing there were none present, one of them said, "We should check carefully. The Zhids know how to hide themselves well." I heard the door of the dark little room open, and someone with an electric lamp entered. I took hold of an axe next to the broken oven. I promised myself that if the Jew snatcher caught a glimpse of me and tried to arrest me, I would split open his head. He entered. I made out a black hat and a face with a thin beard. He walked along the walls, holding the lamp, peeking into every corner. The Jew snatcher moved deeper into the room. I could hear his breath. He was standing with his back to me. The axe was planted firmly in my palm, awaiting the moment to fulfill my oath. I was waiting for him to turn and notice me. A powerful desire for revenge arose within me at that moment. I had never experienced such a strong compulsion. I waited for him to turn his head. I wanted to avenge my bloodied mother. The Jew snatcher focused his light in every direction, but he never thought to turn around, and he left the room. I was terrified of the Jew snatchers and the stormtroopers who were raiding Jewish homes. I spent day and night in my little room in Vilna 14, covered in rags, thinking about where and how to devise myself a malina, a word that quickly became popular in the ghetto. It meant a place where one could hide from the chapunas, from the Jew snatchers. My apartment was in a wooden garret located on the second floor. It was wide open and undoubtedly would have been a target of searches. The Jew snatchers were skilled at sniffing out Jews. Recently, they had come with axes and search dogs. The only possible hiding place was in the chimney of a broken stove in the kitchen. At night, I carefully removed a few bricks and slid myself into its upper reaches. The moon lit the way for me. For 3 nights, I contorted myself into the chimney until my lungs were poisoned with soot. One day, it occurred to me that there must be an open space under the metal roof, beneath the window. If I could make an opening and carefully conceal it, it would be possible to crawl up there and actually live there. At the entrance, by our apartment door, there was a dark niche where we used to store wood. I tore off one of its planks and made an opening in the metal roof. The malina was a little bit more than a crawl space. There was only enough room for me to lie down, and it was barely possible to turn onto my back. Crawling in feet first, I could replace the wooden plank behind me and secure it from the inside with the help of a wire, so nobody could enter. That's how I remained in my malina for 7 weeks. I pierced a tiny hole in the metal roof, and in that needle of light, a needle shine, I wrote my poetic cycle, Faces in Swamps. I burned myself whenever my body came into contact with the metal roof, which overheated in the hot July sun. I could barely wait for nightfall. My wife, who moved through town without the required patches, made her way there at dusk. She slid a slice of bread underneath the plank for me, and I did not dare open the malina because the Jew snatchers could burst in at any moment. Thank you for listening. I hope that you consider reading From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg, and I would very much love and appreciate your comments. Thank you.